This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
You know that story we all learn in school? That the Renaissance was this huge Big Bang for the modern world? A massive explosion of art and science that single-handedly dragged Europe out of the Middle Ages? It's a great story, but what if it isn't the whole story?
Right, let's just dive straight into the big puzzle. If the Renaissance was really the engine of modernity, then you'd think its birthplace, Italy, would have been the very first modern country. But it wasn't, not even close. For centuries, it stayed stuck in the very medieval world it was supposed to have replaced. So, what gives?
To figure this out, we've got to challenge that simple story. We have to look past the beautiful sculptures and paintings, and instead peek under the hood at the political and social machinery of the time, right where it all started.
And don't get me wrong, the Renaissance was an absolutely incredible cultural explosion. I mean, starting in the 1300s, you get this amazing rediscovery of classical art, of learning, a whole new focus on what humans could achieve. This is the stuff we credit with laying the groundwork for pretty much everything modern.
And that just makes the mystery even deeper, doesn't it? The logic seems so simple. The place with the magic ingredient for modernity should have been the first to modernize. But it didn't happen. Italy, and its neighbor Spain, stayed deeply medieval for ages. It's a fascinating historical puzzle, so let's start putting the pieces together.
All right, so first stop on our investigation, Southern Europe. We're looking at Italy and Spain, because in these places, the old medieval power structures weren't just hanging on by a thread. They were absolutely thriving.
Down in Southern Europe, the old ways were rock solid. In Italy, you've got the papacy literally using theology as a hands-on tool for governing. Over in Spain, the monarchy is using it to justify their total control. So the biggest takeaway here is this. For the people in charge, the system wasn't broken. In fact, it was working perfectly.
And this right here is the absolute key. Because the system was so stable, the Renaissance didn't look like some dangerous revolutionary virus. Nah. It looked more like a cool new software update. You know, a feature that just made the old operating system look way better and more sophisticated.
So how do they pull that off? Simple. The popes, the princes, all the powerful families, they became the biggest sponsors of the Renaissance. They were hiring guys like Michelangelo and building huge libraries, not to undermine their own power, but to show it off. The Renaissance was basically absorbed, co-opted. It became a fancy decoration for the very system it was supposed to replace.
Okay, so if the Renaissance didn't spark a revolution in Italy, what was it that traveled north and completely changed the game for everyone else? Well, it wasn't the art, and it wasn't some grand new philosophy. It was something way more practical.
The thing that actually went viral was humanism, but not in the way we might think of it today. It was more like an educational package, a toolkit for how to be a more effective, eloquent, and ethical person, all based on the classics. And what's crucial to understand is that its goal wasn't to challenge religion, it was to produce better people to serve the existing powers, whether that was the state or the church.
And you can literally trace how it spread. First, Italy's got all this wealth, which creates a huge market for these new educational tools. Then, a little invention called the printing press comes along, making these textbooks cheap and easy to copy. So the thing that's spreading like wildfire isn't a dangerous idea, it's a set of practical how-to guides. And this catalyst is about to be dropped into some very, very different social test tubes up north. And this is where the real explosion happens. Because when you take this one single Italian catalyst, this humanist toolkit, and you pour it into the completely different political and religious mixtures of Northern Europe, well, you get three totally distinct chemical reactions. I mean, just look at this. You can see the theory in action. You have the exact same input, humanist education, and it produces three wildly different outcomes across Europe. This is the proof. It wasn't the catalyst itself that was so revolutionary. It was the unique conditions already brewing in each country that decided what kind of explosion you'd get. So let's break that down. In France, they were busy building a strong central government, and humanism gave them the language and tools to do it. In Britain, it basically became the training manual for the ruling class, how to be an effective gentleman running parliament or the courts. But then you get to Germany, a place just simmering with religious frustration. They take that core humanist idea, ad fontes, back to the source, and they apply it not to some Roman orator, but to the Bible itself. And that lit the fuse for the Protestant Reformation.
So this brings us to the final, critical piece of the puzzle. If the Renaissance wasn't really a fight against classical philosophy, then what was the real battle that gave birth to modern thought?
You know, we hear all the time that the scientific revolution was about rejecting Aristotle. But was it? Were people like Galileo really getting into arguments with a Greek philosopher who'd been dead for almost 2,000 years?
The short answer is no. They were fighting a totally different beast. See, there were really two Aristotles. You had the original Greek philosopher, a brilliant guy all about asking questions and inquiry. And then you had University Aristotle, a rigid, dogmatic version that had been translated into Latin, mashed together with Christian theology, and turned into this unquestionable authority that formed the entire basis of a university education.
So, and this is so important, the target wasn't the ideas themselves, it was the institution. The scientific revolution was in many ways a rebellion against a fossilized educational system that treated Aristotle not as a philosopher you could debate, but as a theological fact you had to memorize.
And this really gets to the heart of the whole thing. The birth of modern thought wasn't a fight against philosophy. It was a fight to free inquiry, to free science, politics, and philosophy from a system where theology was the final, unarguable authority on everything.
So, it turns out the simple story of the Renaissance isn't so simple after all. It wasn't the catalyst that mattered most, it was the context it landed in. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. What other great revolutions in history might we be misunderstanding by focusing too much on the spark and not enough on the powder keg it fell into?
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.